Welcome everyone. My name is Brenda Chisholm-Beaton. I am the president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities and also the mayor of the town of Port Hawkesbury. So I just wanted to take the opportunity, of course, to welcome you all here today to our Women in Municipal Politics webinar. So we will be going from 10 to 11:30 roughly. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that this event takes place in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. They acknowledge the peace and friendship treaties signed in this territory and recognize that we are all treaty people. I'd also like to mention, as I'm sure it won't be a surprise, as everyone saw the "we are recording" button pop on the screen. So we are recording the session in case any women who unfortunately haven't been able to hop on this morning. And I do know that we do have some women who were unable to, certainly due to a lot of the tragic fires that are happening across the province. So we are definitely going to make that session available if need be. I want to take this wonderful opportunity to introduce our presenter, and then I will turn it over to Sarah. So we have Sarah Dobson with us this morning. Sarah is a lawyer at Cox and Palmer. She graduated from Dalhousie University with a degree in political science and economics in 2016, and with a law degree from the Schultz School of Law in 2020. Sarah and co-author Grace Evans wrote "On Their Shoulders: the women who paved the way in Nova Scotia politics," profiling the first 50 women to serve as a member of the Legislative Assembly in Nova Scotia. And this is the part I really love, Sarah. The proceeds from the book started a scholarship out at Dalhousie University that is awarded to 2 female political science students every year. Sarah worked as a law clerk at the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal before returning to Cox and Palmer in their litigation group. So without further ado, over to you, Sarah, and thank you so much for joining us today. We so are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction. So yes, my name is Sarah Dobson. I'm currently an associate at Cox and Palmer in our Halifax office. We have offices all throughout the Atlantic provinces, but one of my main interests over the past few years has been women in politics, and specifically focusing on women here in Nova Scotia politics, because, you know, keeping things on a local level, we get a lot of data incoming from different countries and across the world, but I wanted to kind of take a look at what's happening here at home. So I put together just a brief agenda. So I'm going to go through just an overview of kind of the history of women in politics here in Nova Scotia. I won't bore you with too many details, but I thought it gives some good context and background to what I'm going to be talking about a little later. So we'll go through some of that. We'll go through what I learned in making the book, which was mentioned. It's called "On Their Shoulders," and it profiles the first 50 women to serve as an MLA. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about, over the last year, I've been delving into some of the data from municipal and provincial elections here in Nova Scotia. So I put together some charts showing you know, the numbers of women who are running and the numbers of women who are getting elected at both levels. So we'll speak about that, and then the lessons we can learn from that data and the questions that that data kind of leave us with moving forward in the province. If anyone also has any questions or comments, just interject. It's not too formal here today, and I'll try my best to answer them. So as a brief introduction, who I am, like I said, I am a lawyer, but I did a degree in political science prior to my law degree. And when I was in my first year of that degree, I got a job as a page in the Nova Scotia legislature. And that's still one of my favorite jobs that I've ever had. It was so much fun. And I got to meet all of the members of the House, but particularly the women. And I think at that time there was about 10 to 12 women sitting in the legislature. And uh, I got to know them all really well, and I kind of started thinking, I knew as a statistic at that time that there had been about 50 women elected in the province, and 10 of them were sitting right in front of me. So I started thinking, how recent is this history? And where are these women who've served in the legislature? And could I possibly track them all down and speak to them? So that kind of gave me the idea for this book, which is called On Their Shoulders. I did end up tracking down the first 50 women. And at the time I wrote this, which was 2020, there had only been 50 women elected ever. Now I think the number is about 60. So that is promising. We're moving at a much faster rate now than we were for the first 200 years of Nova Scotia's political history. But I did end up tracking down all of the women or their families if they had passed away and getting to speak with them in putting together the book. And one thing that I had been thinking about, especially over the last year, was the role that municipal politics played in the making of this book. We had a lot of women that we spoke with who got their start in municipal politics before going on to be elected provincially. And so I always had this question at the back of my mind, which was there a reason for that? Were women getting their start in municipal politics? And is there something we could be learning from municipal politics in terms of the participation of women? And so that question had lingered in the back of my mind after making this book. And I started working here at Cox & Palmer, and we have a partner here named Kevin Latimer who does a lot of work with municipalities across the province. So we started having ongoing discussions about my work with women in politics and the municipalities, and that led me to embark on this exercise of finding out the data from these last few elections and seeing if we could learn anything from those numbers. So a brief history. Nova Scotia elected its first representative government in 1758. And the first woman who was elected provincially was 200 years later in 1960. I always say this when I'm talking about my work and On Their Shoulders, but for perspective on how recent this history is, Grace and I, who's the co-author of this book, and she was also a political science student, we interviewed the second woman ever elected in Nova Scotia, who is alive today, and we went out and had a coffee with her. So the history of women's participation in Nova Scotia politics is so very recent. And in fact, only a handful of the women had passed away at the time of writing this book. A few more have passed away since. But, we spoke with pretty much everyone going back to the very beginning. So it's really not, it's not a history that stems back to obviously 1758 or anything close to there. And that's kind of why we wanted to do the project now, because, we're kind of trying to preserve some of that knowledge and some of those stories that are still walking around among us. So there's some evidence that between 1758 and 1851, before legislation was brought in that explicitly excluded women from the vote, some women actually did vote in Nova Scotia during that period, but we'll never quite know exactly how many or who did that. But in 1851, legislation was passed that officially excluded women from the vote, and that was the case until 1918. In 1918, some women officially got the right to vote in Nova Scotia, not all. And with that, they also got the right to run for office. The first women to put their name on the provincial ballot did so in 1929. Their names were Grace McLeod Rogers and Bertha A. Donaldson. Of course, they lost, but I always think of their names when I'm thinking of, this history, because we speak about Gladys Porter, who went on to become the first elected member of the legislature, but those were the women who actually put their hand up first 40 years before anyone ever got elected. And here is Gladys Porter. So she is the first woman to ever be elected provincially, but she also was the first woman to run in Nova Scotia history for the mayor of any town. So she was a pretty impressive woman. But also that trend I mentioned earlier of noticing these women who seem to be getting their starts in municipal politics before going on to other areas of politics, that started with the very first woman to ever be elected provincially in Nova Scotia, and that's Miss Porter. She served as the mayor for 11 years, starting in 1946. And then she was elected to Province House in 1960, representing Kings North. And she is quite famous for saying that she wanted no one to vote either against her or for her for being a woman, but she wanted to be considered just a human being. And I always remember that quote because I think we're still kind of far off from that goal of hers, but it's a lofty one. In my research, I found this piece from the Register from 1946, and it's titled "Kentville Elects Province's First Woman Mayor." And I found this quite interesting for a few reasons, but especially at the end. It says, a tireless worker in the community, Mrs. Porter is credited with a fine record of service, particularly during the war years. She's the head of several organizations, but politically has remained an independent. And then after working the polls all of election day, Mrs. Porter, without waiting for the final returns, took over her duties as instructor of the cooking class at the Kentville Evening Technical class. So I saw this and I just had to put it in here because I think it speaks to where we were at the time when we were electing our first woman as mayor in this province, but it also speaks to who she was as a person. So some more quick statistics just to get caught up to present day. As I mentioned, Melinda McLean was the second woman elected in 1974, and we spoke to her for the making of our book. And then Alexa McDonough was third in 1981. And Alexa McDonough's election was quite important for the province because once she took her seat in the legislature, there was never again a time where there were no women elected. She served until, I think, 1993 or 1995. And by that time, there were other women who had joined her. And so there was no longer a time when you looked out at the Nova Scotia legislature and saw only men. And then in 1985, Maxine Cochrane became the first female cabinet minister. And again, this history, it happens, but it happens slowly. The first woman elected was 1960, and then 25 years later, first cabinet minister. And in 2013, Diana Whalen became the first female deputy premier. And of course, we still have not had a female premier in this province. At the time that I wrote this book, I think there had been 4 provinces that had not had a female premier, and we were one of them. And I think it's even less now. So we are one of the remaining provinces who have not broken that barrier down. And I also just wanted to mention here, it's a theme that'll come up later, but 1985 was when Maxine Cochrane became the first cabinet minister, but it took much longer for women to fill certain cabinet roles in this province. For example, the first female minister of finance was Maureen McDonald in 2012, which is when I was a page, for context. And the first female minister of justice was Lena Diab in 2013, which again is when I was a page. So there was still barriers to be broken even after that initial appointment, and there still are today. So we're going to get into some data. Try not to be too, in the weeds with it, but I do think it's interesting, and it shows us kind of where we are in terms of who's running and who's getting elected in this province. So I took the elections data from the municipal and the provincial elections held between 2008 and 2022. I think there were 4 municipal elections and 4 major provincial elections, but there's by-elections in the province as well. And I examined those numbers through a gendered lens. And I'll note that the government actually keeps track of the municipal data. So I was able to access the numbers on how many women ran and how many women were elected in each of the elections. The province doesn't keep track of that data. So I had to go through and count, and like I had the list of everybody running, and I Googled them, find out who they were, and count every single person. So those numbers are just based off of my count from a giant list of candidates. So I think that's important, but they should be pretty accurate. And I'll also note that I used gendered language in this presentation, but I also included non-binary candidates and elected officials as well in these numbers. So the main things I was looking at when I looked at these numbers, I wanted to know how many women ran for office in each election, and was it increasing or decreasing between the elections? And then I wanted to know how many women were successfully elected in each election, and was that increasing or decreasing? And at what rate was it increasing or decreasing? And then I wanted to look at how did the data differ between municipal and provincial elections? Because again, in the back of my mind, I had this question that was, maybe we can learn something from municipal politics, or maybe there's something we can take from municipal politics and try and translate that into having more women elected provincially and federally. So here is the data. This is the municipal elections. So you'll see the first one was 2008. And in that election, there was 180 female candidates out of 749. So that's roughly 24%, about a quarter. And that translated into 93 elected councillors out of 403, which is about 23%. In 2012, there were 188 female candidates out of 706, which roughly translate to 26%. And that turned into 90 elected councillors out of 372. So that's about 24%. In 2016, we had 185 female candidates out of 666, which is about 28%. And that translated into 93 elected officials out of 346, which is about 27%. So you'll see it's slowly climbing in both categories. And that led to 2020, where we had 222 female candidates out of 684, about 32%. And that translated to 126 out of 327, and that's about 38%. So I'll talk a little later about the things that I noticed from this data, but what was interesting to me is I had only ever looked at the raw numbers. So if you look at the number of elected females, it goes 93, 90, 93, 126. So it seems like for 2008, 2020, or 2012 and 2016, there was really no movement in terms of how many councillors were being elected. But you have to look at the total number of elected officials, because it changes between elections. So it was actually dropping during these years, which means that a higher percentage of women were still getting elected, even though the actual number of them was staying stagnant. And same with the number of female candidates. The percentage was actually rising, even though it doesn't seem like in the raw numbers that very many more women were running. And then we have the provincial data. So these are the ones I've counted in an Excel sheet. So in 2009, we had 54 female candidates out of 217. So that's, again, about a quarter, which is very similar to the municipal numbers. And that translated to 12 elected women out of 52. So that's about 23%. In 2013, there were 42 female candidates, which was a drop, as you can see, 54 to 42. But again, the number of candidates also dropped. So the percentage stayed about 24%, 25%. And that translated to 14 out of 51 elected members, and that's 27%. In 2017, there were 67 candidates out of 203, and that's about a third, 33%. So I remember when we made that milestone of a third in the province. And that led to 16 out of 51, which again is 31%, about a third. And then in the most recent election, 2021, we had 101 female candidates out of 230. So that was quite a jump in terms of the number of women running, and that's 44%. And that led to 20 elected females out of 55 seats, so about 36%. So this data is interesting. I was reading a paper this morning by one of my professors from political science at Dalhousie, Louise Carbert, and she did some work on the 2013 provincial election. And she noted that it was the first time where the three major political parties, the NDP, the Liberals, and the PCs, were barely distinguishable in terms of how many women they were running. So prior to that, the NDP were running the majority of women. And so you weren't seeing the numbers translate as evenly. But I think once we get up to 2013, you see that, 24% translates to 27%. So we're not seeing a giant gap in how many women are running versus getting elected. So what can we learn from this? The first takeaway, I think, is both municipally and provincially, the number of female candidates is trending upward. As I mentioned, it's trending upwards as a percentage of the total candidates, but not necessarily as the strict number of women who are putting their name forward. It's been a slow climb in municipal government. It's up 2% a year between 2008 and 2020. So I'm actually very interested to see the data coming out of the next municipal election to see if, kind of in the post-2020 world, whether that will make a difference in terms of seeing those numbers jump at a quicker rate. Because I do think it's interesting that we have municipal data up till 2020, we have provincial data up till 2021, and I do wonder the impact that kind of the year of 2020 and everything that was going on in the world at that time might have on this data. So the next few years will be very interesting to add to this. It's been more scattered in provincial government in terms of candidates. It actually dropped in percentage between 2009 and 2013, and then it jumped at a much quicker rate between 2017 and 2021. So not quite as even as the municipal numbers. So again, municipally, the percentage of candidates overall grew from 24% to 32% between 2008 and 2020. It's growing, but it's growing slowly and steadily. Provincially, the percentage of candidates grew from 25% to 44%, so a bigger margin between 2009 and 2021. And then both municipally and provincially, the number of females who actually got elected has also been trending upwards. Municipally, it went from 23% in 2008 to 38% in 2020. And provincially, it went from 23% in 2009 to 36% in 2021. So very similar numbers in terms of the actual outcomes of the elections. And then this last provincial election was kind of the one that made me pause the most. And that's because, and I'll go back to it, that's because in all of the other, so in the municipal, you'll see when 24% of women are running, we were getting 23% of women elected, 26% to 24%, 28% to 27%. So we were seeing that when women ran, they were getting elected at approximately the same rates. And actually in 2020, more women got elected than ran. But in the province, while we saw that trend for 2009, 2013, and 2017, what made me pause was 2021, because we are seeing a really great jump in how many women were running, but it didn't quite jump as much in terms of how many women were elected. And so that is kind of one of the things that I had been thinking about when I was studying this data. And of course, you can never know for sure exactly what happened there, but if you dig into the numbers, I think likely this has to do with women running in winnable seats, women running for winnable parties. For example, the Green Party ran about 20 of those women that were included in that data. And so that translated into no seats, but it greatly increased the number of women running. And this is kind of an age-old question about women running, where they're running. And it's something we heard a lot from the women that we interviewed for the book, is there is this kind of idea that parties will run women, but not necessarily in the seats they think that they're going to win in. So that's why that number made me pause and take a look at it. And I think it'll be interesting to add another provincial election to see kind of how that turns out and whether that was a fluke or whether we're seeing the trend change in terms of the women of candidates are still increasing, but it's not translating into the number of elected seats. So moving past the numbers, like I said, they didn't show a very noticeable difference between the municipal and provincial elections in terms of, the municipalities weren't running more women necessarily in terms of percentage than the province, and they weren't seeing more women winning as a terms of a percentage than the province. Of course, with the most note, the last provincial election, which seems to stand out. So we stand approximately at the same place now at both levels. I think it's both around 35% women municipally and provincially. And then, of course, the numbers can only tell, part of the story. So that gets us to where we are today. But there's always stories behind the numbers. And like I mentioned, I've spoken to the first 50 women and their families in putting together my book. And I also spoke to some municipally elected women in putting together this presentation. And these are kind of getting past the numbers and trying to figure out why. Why aren't we seeing 50% candidates, and why aren't we seeing 50% elected officials being women? And so here are some of the barriers that came up a lot in my conversations with the women who have ran and have served in politics in Nova Scotia. The first one is the perception of voters. Sometimes I think this one is overestimated by those of us who are women in politics or who aspire to be a woman in politics. I think it's the first one you think of when someone asks you what barriers are there for women getting elected. I think people think, well, voters aren't voting for women. Voters perceive women differently, which certainly is true. And we heard many stories of this. The one that always comes to mind is probably about half of the women, and especially the ones who have served either as mayor or as cabinet minister in those high roles. They tell stories about being called or assumed to be the assistant in many scenarios. So they'll show up to events. And one woman actually, who was a cabinet minister, she said she showed up to an event, she parked in the spot that was intended for her as the minister joining the event, and people came over and yelled at her and said, "That's for the minister, like assistants can't park here." And of course she was the minister. So you hear those stories about the perception of women a lot. And also you hear stories about, especially women while they're running, comments on appearance, comments on whether their work history is appropriate for the role they're running for. And those are comments that, male counterparts don't necessarily become subject to. So that is still a barrier. And I think it leads into the next one, which is self-perception. And this is a huge issue that's acknowledged, especially for those who work behind the scenes in trying to get women to run. Most political parties have behind the scenes staffers that are out in the community trying to find women to put on the ballot for their party. And if you speak to them, they will say one of the biggest barriers is that women, when they're asked to run, will often say no. And that has a lot to do with their own self-perception, and often they're waiting until they feel ready. They're waiting until they feel competent. They think they have to, have 6 careers before they end up in politics. Whereas if you ask a man, they're much more likely to put up their hand and say, "I think I can do this, and I think I'm ready, despite the amount of experience I have, or despite my background." So women are much more likely to wait until they have something to add, or they feel they have something to add, which I think is something we're trying to tackle behind the scenes when we're going out and speaking to women. Most of them are more than ready. They're more ready than the men who are putting up their hands, but they still feel the sense that it's like imposter syndrome, the sense that they have to do more before they put their hand up. I don't think this is an official statistic, but I think it's kind of a colloquial statistic. It's like women or men are 5 times more likely to say yes when asked to run than a woman. And women have to be asked 5 times before they say yes. The third one is societal expectations. In my opinion, I think this is the key moving forward. I think the largest barrier that many face is, and this is across professions, not just in politics, but is the fact that we still have these expectations of women in society, including, running the household, raising the children, and politics is a demanding career. So when you combine those things, I think, one, many women wait until they feel like they don't have those societal expectations on them anymore, or 2, they feel like they can't do it because of them. And when they do it, they face those barriers. And, we spoke to a lot of women who say the schedules are just not kind to mothers. The province house schedule, the meetings at night, there's just no regard for the fact that some people don't have somebody at home running a household, because that's the way that our institutions were set up. They were set up with all men for hundreds of years. So those things were never really thought about until very recently. The fourth one is abuse and harassment. Of course, women are more likely to face abuse, both from the public, but also from within institutions. And these are the stories that you hear that women don't necessarily want published or put in a book or put in a presentation, but believe me, they exist. And they exist for elected officials, even though they seem like they're at the highest level of power, it's still happening. And it's also still happening at a lower level on like the staffer and intern side. And a lot of people who get their start working their way through institutions, they start as maybe a municipal intern or an intern in a party. They're much more likely to leave because of the barriers that they face within those institutions. And so they might start with this ambition to one day run, and they never end up doing so because of the way that they're treated. And then this last one, I call it the halls of power. And I think the best way to describe it is to read a quote from one of our interviews. So this is from Vicky Conrad, who was an NDP MLA from 2006 to 2013. And I always think of this quote when I think of this particular barrier, but she said, "I was not intimidated by being a woman in politics, but I realized very quickly that politics, even today, is still very much a man's world. It's hard to break through and be heard on what your beliefs are, how you think policy should be structured, and what changes you think are needed within government. When I was first elected in 2006, I was naive. I remember my first day sitting at caucus table and my blinders were ripped off immediately to the reality of politics." So this one, I think, just because you become elected and just because you become a number in that column of elected women, it doesn't necessarily mean that in the inner circles you have the power that you thought you were going to have or that you should have. And we hear these repeated stories of frustration from elected women that once they're in, they don't feel like they're being heard, and they end up leaving because of it, or they don't feel like, they can one day take the role of power within that institution, and so they end up leaving. So this one's really just who's making the decisions, who's leading the ship, and just acknowledging that the fact that the numbers are there does not translate necessarily into the levels of power. And with these, I also think it's very interesting to consider them in light of the municipal and provincial divide. And this is, something that I would like to continue to do work on in speaking to women, but I would really like to know whether there's a difference in any of these barriers, or the longer list of barriers that exists between municipal and provincial governments. And also, I'll note too that a lot of the women also get their start on school boards. And I think that's another area that, could offer some really interesting insights. But I do wonder whether, for example, societal expectations, somebody who might live in Sydney, whether it's more attainable or it feels more attainable for them to run municipally rather than provincially, where they're required to be in Halifax for weeks on end and nights on end. So I think there's some work to be done here, and especially work to be done in learning from municipalities and how we can attack these barriers better. This is a picture my friend Grace, who wrote this book with me, sent me this week. So she is a staffer, and she was down somewhere in the archives of Province House and found this tape, which is Global News, dated July 6, 2004. And the piece was called "Nova Scotia Ready for a Female Premier." So I just threw this in here because she sent it to me. And I mean, the answer is yes, but we still haven't had one. So we're basically in the same place, and we're talking about the same things that we were talking about in 2004. And then lastly, me and Grace presented about our book at a Girl Guides conference 2 weeks ago. And, we broke it down. We explained what politics was. We explained what elections were. And then we explained that women are not being elected at the same rate as men, and that, men, I think the statistic at the time of writing this book was that there was 50 women elected. Now it's about 60. And there had been over 750 men elected throughout the province history provincially. So we told them that statistic, and they had their hands up in the air and they wanted to ask questions. And these were the questions they asked. And they stumped us, for one, because the first girl raised her hand and said, "But why are women less respected than men?" And Grace and I were just like, I don't know if we can answer that question. And why would someone want to pay a man more than a woman? And why do mothers have to take care of the children? And why hasn't a woman been president? And those were the 4 questions we got. And they've stuck with me because I think, at the end of a presentation where I talked about numbers for 20 minutes and, we're seeing 2% increase and we're seeing, slowly climbing, we're seeing the numbers getting better. But at the end of the day, it's really these questions that we're still asking ourselves, and that the kids are asking us. So I just wanted to end with that because I do think that in some ways it's really this simple, and these are the things that we should be asking. And then this is just a slide about Cox and Palmer, where I work. And lastly, I'm happy to have any discussions or take any questions or comments.
Okay, thanks so much, Sarah. I'm just wondering if you want to take your slides down.
Sure.
That way we can see everybody's beautiful faces and have some, what I think is going to be some really engaging conversation. I know there's lots of questions that popped up in the chat that I'm happy to relay, or call on women to ask them themselves. I have a bunch of notes too, some questions. This is a topic I'm pretty passionate about as well on many levels. So I guess the first question that we have here. Okay. So Sandra Snow is with us today, and she mentioned that the mayor of Kentville elected to council 1943 as mayor, 1946 to 1960. Do you want to add anything to that, Sandra?
Cottage Porter is, led the way for us, a trailblazer. And it's funny, we had a letter here in the desk. It's now over at our Historical Society. And Gladys, after her election, was thanking all of her supporters. And what she says in the letter is that in the time that she had voted and before the election results were called, she actually went home, did the dishes, did a load of wash, and she documents this in this letter. And it's, it's unbelievable. And, I realize that we're talking 1946, but still, the fact that as a woman who has, she didn't know at the time, but, she has her name standing for mayor of one of, at the time would have been one of the bigger towns in Nova Scotia. And she does her democratic duty and votes, and then goes home and does all of her housewife duties. And then she comes back to her group. So it's just one of those letters that just, it really hits home how that power dynamic is so different. And, you wonder at the same time, has it changed over the years?
Good question. Sarah, did you want to weigh in on that?
Like I said, I do think that those expectations are one of the biggest barriers that still remains. So, this is a personal opinion, but I don't think it's changed as much as we'd like to think that it has. I think it's changing. Yeah. It's changed within individual households, but in terms of on the scale of what we're still asking of women, I think that is still one of the, I think if you followed a female today who's in elected office, you would see them doing the exact same thing that Gladys Porter did. So that's a personal opinion, but.
Sarah, so, okay, just, I think on many levels, I definitely agree. And I feel like it's a double-edged sword because it's self-perception also versus community perception. And we literally had this conversation at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities last week in Toronto about this thing, particularly knocking on doors and people literally saying, oh, well, how are you going to manage this? Who's going to take care of the kids? And that's a question that's being asked to really only the female candidates. And no one is ever asking that same question to male candidates when they go to the door. So I feel like it definitely is still kind of a bit of a double-edged sword. And you're exactly right. When women are asked to run, you have to ask them multiple times. And part of that is like, oh, how am I going to juggle it all, right? Yeah, for sure. So thank you, Sandra, and thanks for that, Sarah. So we do have a few other questions. We have one from Paula Huntley. Why do you think there is no discussion of a female premier in Nova Scotia? And Paula, do you want to just elaborate on that? I know it was that lovely 2004 picture. Something that somebody dug out of the archives, but Paula, hop on and say a few words if you don't mind.
Thanks, Brenda. Hi, everybody. I guess as soon as Sarah had mentioned that set off my radar. And, I think about when there's an election and everybody ramps up and it's always about the males and their name is out there first. But even in any discussion, nobody says, how come there's no women running? Or does any party focus on making sure they're promoting women more and then getting their names forward? And I think it comes back to another question that I had. I'm always looking for some sort of, in data, I'm always looking for, has there been a scale? So should it be 5 women and 5 men? Set the standard and then let there be a bar that someone can actually move toward. Because I'm not just saying this because I'm a woman and I'm surrounded by all these powerful beings right now, because I do feel that when I'm going to work. However, I think everybody needs a scale. It doesn't matter who you are, men or women. And I think it's just an opinion, but once a scale is set, I think then sometimes in people's minds, they can go, oh, so we're kind of putting out an expectation that we should have more women running. Not to everybody, but I don't know. I think the more we talk about it, the more people it becomes an earworm. And then all of a sudden it's like, how is this? I haven't heard this in so long. Now everybody's talking about it. What's going on? There has to be hype about it. Just an opinion.
Thanks, Paula. Over to you, Sarah.
I do have an opinion, especially on the provincial and federal level, and why the discussion, I do think your point is interesting about there not being a lot of discussion about not having a female premier, and why that doesn't seem like it seems like something that should be a big deal, and it should be, because the other provinces are ahead of us, and we rarely hear that talked about. I think that is because the nature of party politics, you put forward one person to lead you, and if that person's a man, then you have to stifle all conversation about having a female premier, because if you're talking about it, then you're saying, well, we shouldn't win. And so I think within parties, it even silences the women who are talking about it behind the scenes, because if you go out and you say, we haven't had a female premier, but your leader is male, you're going to be punished for that. And so those conversations, while they happen behind the scenes, it's difficult to bring them to the forefront when you're still having men in leadership positions, because you're basically undermining your own party. And so I see that, and I think it'll get better. We do have a female leader now, Claudia Chender. So she's going to be able to talk about it. And so at least it'll bring that discussion forward a little bit. But when you have 3 men running against each other, it's just not something that they're willing to talk about.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah. And I know Allison has her hand up, and she also sent me a question. So I'm going to read it, and then we're going to hand things over to Allison to add some more context. So Allison is wondering if there is information or data that looks at regions, ridings, wards where there is a trend in electing female candidates. For example, where in Nova Scotia are you most likely to be elected as a female candidate? So over to you, Allison, if you want to add a little more context.
You're muted.
There we go.
There you go,
Thank you.
Allison.
I think my question is clear and speaks for itself, but I wanted to chime in the discussion we were having earlier regarding gender roles and have we evolved from that. And I was wondering if there is any data out there that looks at or considers divorce rates among elected women, I feel anecdotally, many women find themselves in a position of divorce or separation once they find themselves in a position of power or leadership, and then maybe unable to take care of their quote unquote duties at home and the effects that that has on the family and the marriage in particular.
Very interesting comment, Allison. Sarah, what's your thoughts on that?
So I have not seen, if that data exists, I have not seen it. But I think that's actually really fascinating, and I love that idea. And I don't know, like, of course it would translate in divorce rates, but I mean, it also does translate in stories. Like if you speak to women, whether they end up divorced, whether they were single to begin with, you hear the stories of difficulty, and you hear the stories, I think it was mentioned, of being at the doorstep. And of course, when you're in a municipality, especially, but even in a province and in a riding, places are small and people know each other. And so you'll get the comments that are like, and these are true stories as well, but, oh, but your children are terribly behaved and it's because you're not at home. Or, you know, you get that reaction from teachers, you get that reaction from people within your community. So yes, I think the perception is still there that it impacts the home, and I'm sure it does, but it would be interesting to see if that translates into numbers. That would be fascinating.
Well, I feel still today, men don't really like empowered women. They don't really like women in leadership. So when that's your wife, you really don't like it. And then back to my previous question, is there data that, have you broken down the data any further to show where in Nova Scotia you're more likely to be elected if you're a woman? Has that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, and I should have said before I went through the data that the municipal data is obviously on a province-wide scale. So it is difficult because certain municipalities obviously do better than others. And so we have some municipalities that have gender parity, and then we have some municipalities that have no women still, where it's 100% still men. So it is really difficult to look at it in the aggregate because it's so community based, the system. But that was the data I had. And I think you could, and you can go down into specific municipalities to see who's doing better. And I'm sure some of you can think of ones off the top of your head who are doing better than others. And whether that's a rural divide, whether that's by place, I would hesitate to draw those conclusions from the data. But in terms of the province, that's a really interesting question that I haven't thought about. And I'm not sure whether it's true that certain ridings have a better history of electing women, because I think it's more connected to which party is running women where. Like when we talk about winnable ridings, we're talking about it on a party basis. So we're saying, sure, if you know the NDP, well, that's a bad example, but if the PCs run a woman, but it's in a seat that they are never going to win and they know that, then how is that really contributing to equality? And so what we want to be seeing is women running in those competitive ridings, or in ridings where you see the tradition of that party being elected, and not stuffing them into, you know, ridings that you think you're not going to win, or you are not going to win, just to up the numbers and to make them look more equal on the surface. So that is the winnable riding debate, and that has been going on for a long time, since women started running. And there is a really big perception on a province level that this is happening, and it's still happening, whether it's intentional or not. And so that's why I found Louise Carbera's piece so interesting. I just looked at it this morning, and it was in 2013. That was the year that the parties kind of evened out in terms of their candidates. but you would have to dig into that to find how even those numbers really were, and if a lot of those women were being run in basically like campaigns that were dead on arrival.
That's a really good point, Sarah. And, you know, so I mean, it's easy to check off a box and artificially say, oh yeah, we're all about gender parity type thing.
Yeah.
So I wanted to turn things over to Tracy Jones-Grant, who has a question. So over to you, Tracy.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your presentation. And I'm going to throw a couple of wrenches into it for you. Just so that you know, I'm the Managing Director for Diversity, Inclusion, African Nova Scotian Affairs with Halifax. So when I was listening, of course, it immediately jumps out to me that we're not also talking about all women in some respects. When I think about historical communities in this province, I'm specifically thinking about Indigenous and African Nova Scotian women. And, you know, I think we missed a big piece, and maybe I didn't hear it, but we had our very first Black woman elected to the House of Assembly in Yvonne Atwell back in
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, Yvonne was the first back in 1998. And so when you're looking at that list of barriers to women being involved in politics, I think it's important, even when we're talking to our little women, our young women, that we acknowledge and identify that we have barriers related to race, racism, accessibility. You know, when we think about women and all that we do, what about our women with disabilities who are more than willing, interested, and capable of being in government, but are shunned right off the top because of a disability? So I really just think that in particular, you know, I can speak through my lens as a woman of African ancestry, that the barriers to government, whether it's municipal or provincial, are far greater, and the hurdles to overcome are far greater. And there's even the simple piece of, as a Black woman, walking up to a stranger's door and knocking could put me in harm's way as it could no other woman. And it doesn't even mean physical harm, it's that mental and psychological harm because of the history and the stories of our province. And then you compound that, if I'm an Indigenous woman, and the perceptions of me as an Indigenous woman, just knocking on somebody's door and the barriers that I face there. So I think as we talk about women in leadership and women in government, we need to really take some time to have those hard conversations about race, racism, ableism, privilege, all of those little bits and pieces that are continuing to shut the door on those women's active participation in leadership and government. So again, thank you, but I did want to raise those points because as you continue to give your presentation, I think leaving off race and racism kind of leaves a little bit of a gap that we do need to be comfortable talking about. So thank you.
No, I think you're completely right. And one of the things we often said when we started parading this book around is if you like open it and flip through the pages, you can see all the photos kind of going quickly. And it's just essentially like a record of privileged white women back to back to back to back to back all the way up until now. And it's very clear when you read it cover to cover. And I mean, it's great, you see the stories, but the stories are of one type of person getting elected. And that's still the truth now. And it's the truth for candidates as well. Even if you don't end up winning, who is getting nominated, who's getting put forward by parties, and then who's winning? Well, they're winning because they're getting put forward. As we saw, the data shows you can get elected if you get put forward, but you won't be put forward unless you fit into one type of box. So that's absolutely correct. And we're nowhere near we're nowhere near equality on anything except for the bald numbers that are increasing.
Mhm.
It's only the numerics that are going up. It's nothing else.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Tracy, for your thoughtful comments. Definitely on the Indigenous side of things and African Nova Scotia women and around women with disabilities. I mean, that's something I think we all have to certainly take some time to kind of dig down further into trying to determine what does gender equity look like really at the end of the day, and what does diversity look like really at the end of the day. And as you were speaking, just reminded me of a project that I was involved in back in August 2020. We had basically, I want to say Eastern Nova Scotia, all of the 6 First Nation communities, all 10 municipalities, we had representatives from all of the side of the province, working together on a leadership school for women, for LGBTQ plus, Two-Spirit, just as inclusive as we can make it, as barrier-free as we can make it. And that really made a difference. And when we did our statistics, we were looking at, are more women running and getting elected in First Nation communities as well, but also First Nation women can also run in municipal elections as well. So we really wanted to take the time to kind of do things a little bit differently. And we were really pleased with the results at a time in Canada during COVID where women's numbers in participation was dropping in other parts of the country. So we were really proud of that particular project. And at the end of that leadership school, one of the comments, very thoughtful comments that came from one of our Mi'kmaq elders that were presenting and involved was, next time we do this, we want to make sure we invite all the African Canadian candidates, be very purposeful in that, especially the African Canadian grandmothers, to come and partake in a leadership school of like this. Because there's always ways you can do things better, more thoughtfully. Another comment was, let's remove as many barriers also for women with disabilities. So I see this as something potentially that we could work on in advance of 2024. So I may circle back to you. And is there any, so if ever anybody else has any questions, just feel free to unmute, and, Sarah's here. I've got all kinds of questions though, if nobody else has any. All right, so I guess, Sarah, just a question on why. Okay, and I do want to circle back to the girl guide questions. I was like, what? That's amazing. So, why are women not putting themselves forward? It's like such a loaded question. And, the why is something I think as women we have to ask ourselves, why why am I not envisioning myself in this leadership role? But as well, I think we have to kind of shift that to our communities and the culture in our communities. Like, why are our communities not seeing women in that leadership role? And, maybe is that about redefining what leadership is? Is that just, taking the sides off the box of what our normal definition of leadership is? I don't know. But I see Paula has her hand up, so I figure you want to weigh in, so you go ahead.
Thanks, Brenda. I guess the one thing that I wanted to say, I look at this in twofold. One is a woman who wants to enter politics, who's never been in it before. And two, the woman who's already in politics will be soon coming up to election, but has had a rough year for whatever reason. And then not only is it hard on that person, but here's the other thing. What does it present then out into the community? Are women looking at that and going, there is no way that I'm entering my name because that could happen to me, and I'm not ready for that. So I think it's probably years ago it was, yeah, we need to vote, and then now we need somebody in, but I think the big picture and the umbrella is so big now. That's the data that I would like to see. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paula. And you brought up that a great point. So if our goal is getting more women elected and getting more women to step up to leadership and leadership, whatever that form looks like, it's not only elected positions, it's community leadership as well. Like leadership can definitely look like a bunch of different things. But what do we do? How do we support women who do get elected? Because that's hard. In terms of like the municipal code of conduct we're working on, I know lots of women who are just not going to run again because of the miserable time they've had at their council tables. Yeah. How do we support those women? I mean, Sarah, if you like in your work, have you had conversations with women who are currently elected that, you know, some of them are just like, you know what, I just had enough. I tried.
Yeah, and on that, I sometimes when you get asked, especially when you're working with people behind the scenes who are trying to increase these numbers, who are trying to do better, like my aunt, they'll say, well, what can we be doing? What can we be doing to help? What can we be doing to recruit? What can we be doing to keep women in these roles? And often I just think like, I'm not sure how much further you can progress past where society is. Like, and it's an unfortunate answer because changing society is more difficult than me telling you one thing that could be done to help, you know, behind the scenes. But I'm just not sure you can ever quite get past where society is. And you see those things reflected in institutions, and they're all coming from the outer society. So I think it's like, unfortunately, we have to fix the outside before the institution is going to reflect those things. And there's not easy changes where you can just say, you know, we'll institute this rule or we'll do this behind the scenes and that's going to make a giant impact, when it's just a mirror reflecting what is going on the outside. Again, that's an opinion, but
No,
I also think the other thing is, Brenda, you had mentioned about code of conducts. I think whenever there's changes to be made and updates, they need to happen quicker. Because I think that would make people feel more supported.
absolutely, because then all of a sudden we have rules with teeth. So, you know, when people are acting inappropriately, particularly to female elected officials, and I think part of like, and I know we have to take one bite at a time of this massive elephant, but I wish, and yes, we're working on a code of conduct for the province that's going to better enable all elected officials, but particularly women, to know that there's going to be decorum, there's going to be behaviors that just are acceptable and are not acceptable, and like I said, teeth when some, you know, there is a breach that happens. However, one of the things I wish we could have bitten off at the same time was the treatment of women during campaigns and during elections, which is, that's just a whole nother webinar, right, Sarah? I feel like it's a whole nother webinar. You know, so I don't know like what that journey looks like. I don't know how we can make it better for women, and how do we like blaze a better trail for them, you know, whether it's provincial elections or municipal elections, First Nation elections. So it's definitely interesting. And Sandra, you shared something that I'm sure you'd like to speak on, but if you also wanted to weigh in, I'm going to hand things over to you.
All right, Brenda, thank you. So I was fortunate enough to attend a Michelin's conference in Spain in 2019. Michelin, the tire manufacturer, is in 20 different countries, 40 different cities. And when you go to these conferences, they have these amazing speakers. Anyway, we had this politician from Rwanda that spoke to us. And she said that their government made it a rule that there had to be 30% of elected officials had to be women. And she said that's where the shift occurs. And so if you read anything about power, there's truly that dynamic at the 30% spot. And I think what women bring to the table is our voices and how we lead. We often lead from the heart, or at least using our heart when we're decision making. Not that we don't use our brains, because you know, I mean, that's the first thing that goes on the table, but there's also that humanity that is put into it. And I think that a lot of the reason why we haven't seen more women in the party politics is because you have to pick a side, and picking a side is not always what's best for your constituents. And I think Elizabeth May is the one who speaks best about this. I mean, she's a voice of one in Parliament. And when you think about that, her voice has resonated with us. And again, at FCM, we got to hear her last week in Toronto. And she is such an amazing speaker. And she always says, it doesn't matter who gets the benefit, the kudos for having something accomplished, as long as it gets accomplished. And if you think about her voice on climate change, she hasn't been able to move the bar as a politician, but as a voice, she has moved the bar on climate change and on many other things. Her voice is resonating behind the walls of power. So I think that's what's important, is that our voices are important, and the way that we go through a thought process. You know, I spent 20 years in the military, and I'm going to say that the biggest criticism of me as in leadership was that I had too much heart in. So I cared too much about people, and that wasn't, you know, the mission was what was important. It wasn't the people. So I think that's where we shift that power, and we shift how people think. So I don't think that we can lose our voices out there, and we can't lose the heart that we've brought to politics. So that's where I go. And this study it's 200 and some pages. So grab the link and download it. You don't have to read the whole study, but there's some amazing and wonderful things in the work that is currently happening based on the UN sustainability goals. So anyway, I put it out there for you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Sarah, did you want to weigh in on anything? I know we're just like, if you want to weigh in, go over to you.
I was going to comment on the discussion we were having about like implementing policies or codes of conduct to address kind of some of the decorum issues, like the more blatant things that women face. I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of the problems have become much more subtle over the years. Like, I think if you looked at what Gladys Porter would have faced versus what Diana Whalen would have faced in terms of like decorum issues, in terms of actually being confronted with like blatant sexism, it's changed a lot, which is good, but it's also bad because it makes it more difficult to address when you're not being, like, when what you're trying to address is almost difficult to identify or to put your thumb on. And I think that's the same with like other, like how you would experience homophobia now sitting on the floor, I think would be different than it was even 10, 20 years ago. Racism, the same. And so it's really difficult to address those things through policy, because they're happening, one, behind the scenes, and then they're happening in a manner that is subtle and thus difficult to address on paper, and to try and put like a blanket rule over top of it. And I think those are discussions that are also being had, because it's very difficult nowadays to address what the problem is, and you know it when it happens to you, but the way, like, it's difficult to combat that with rules, unfortunately, because, you know, we've gotten so far, but the next bit is just so difficult.
Wow, that's such a good point. Okay, any other questions? Oh, okay, over to you, Christine. How are you?
I'm fine, Brenda. How are you? It's great to see
again.
everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you so
Sarah.
much, Sarah, for this webinar. I think it's absolutely fantastic to talk about how women have progressed over the years. As a mayor for the municipality of the County of Colchester, I'm the first mayor who happens to be female, who has sat in this, who has been in this seat in 137 years of our history. First elected in 2016 and then again in 2020. I think the codes of conduct are absolutely necessary. They are something we absolutely must have. However, what you're seeing more and more of is something that you just talked about, and that is the blatant sexism, but it's more difficult to deal with because more of it is behind the scenes. And what you're seeing is, oh yes, Mayor, that's lovely. And then having someone say, well, you know, I would do it this way. I mean, after all, I am a man and understand much better than she ever would. However, so those things it is the behind the scenes things that can interfere, but it's not only the men. You still have women who are involved with as elected officials. You still have women who are very patriarchal, who will defer to men and do not like to see a strong woman in a position, because we've heard women say to other women, well, what about your children? And an example of this is two candidates in a neighborhood. One was male, one was female. The male candidate came along and he was knocking on doors, and he happened to have his children in a stroller with him. And the people at the door said, oh, how lovely. How that's just wonderful to see a dad out with his kiddies. It's fabulous. And the woman came along and knocked on the door, and they said, don't you have children at home? Why are you applying for this job? So you have that different attitude that is extremely hard to break. Even when you were talking about Gladys Porter, in one of the first lines in that news article, it was Mrs. H.W. Well, H.W., I presume, would have been her husband's name. So she wasn't Mrs. Gladys, she was Mrs. H.W., according to the newspaper. As women, we all go home every night and we do the laundry and we do the cleaning and we take care of the children. I did that for years when I was an executive assistant to a deputy minister and to a minister as well. My kids are grown up now. My husband is gone. I have tons of time but I still do the laundry and I still do the gardening and I still weed the flower bed. So all of those things will, I think, always be there for us. I have been one who has centered myself on the needs of the community, on our residents. What can we do for our residents? How can we follow in the best possible way? How can we work in the best possible way for our municipalities? I've been involved in partisan politics. I don't want to be involved in partisan politics again, but I can tell you that I would give it serious thought if I thought there was a candidate that was doing absolutely nothing or didn't have the credentials to do the job. I would give it thought. I have been asked on 4 separate occasions to run for provincial politics, and once to run for a leader of a party, and I said no to all times. But because I like the municipal level of politics, I think that's the level of politics. It's on the ground. It's the one that's dealing with the people on a daily basis. We are the ones that get things done. And that's what I love about it. But nonetheless, that's my little spiel. It's more than just code of conduct. It's more than just it's all of those things together, all those points that you mentioned. There's a little bit of that in that every one of us as a female in politics faces. So you have to be strong in order to deal with this level of government. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Christine. And I really enjoyed your comments, but not as much as Gail Smith's reaction to your comments. I was like, she's like, yeah, you're right. Did you want to weigh in on that, Gail? There you are.
It's just like I like to listen a lot, and listening to her speak was just like, she's absolutely right in everything she said. Like, I've been a counselor for the town of Middleton for, I think the first year I was elected was in 2016, I think. And we have 2 women on the council. So there's 7 of us, a mayor and 6 councilors. So I'm just thinking as everybody is talking, like, we come to council, there's a decision to be made. I've made up my mind what I think is right. And the other lady also. The other 4 men come in, and I don't want to say that they bully us, but they're always trying to change our minds. Like, whether we think it's right or not, it just, and like somehow things get just slid right on by us. And I think when I come home at night, I think, really? This is not what I wanted to do. That's not how I think. And when she was saying, yes, we have to come home and do our own work and we got to do this. But I've been asked by a couple of the parties to run provincially. And I have always said no, because I truly believe that being in the municipality is where you actually get the work done. You're on the ground, but anyway, thank you for that. I'm sorry, I was making faces. Well,
no, I loved your faces. I was like, because Christine would say something and Gail would be like, yeah, yes.
I love it when I hear people talk like that.
Yes, I just
Thank you
wanted
for
to
that,
give you a
Amici.
chance
Yeah.
to weigh in. Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to share, Gail.
Thank you.
So we are winding down, but I do want to give Kathy a chance to make a comment or ask a question, and then maybe we'll give the last few minutes over to Sarah, I know we're just like, whoa, like we could probably be here till like 6 o'clock tonight. I know this is definitely a fun topic. Go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you so much. And Sarah, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I really, really enjoyed it. I just want to echo what Mayor Blair said. I was at a meeting the other night, and a group of people were singing her praises. She's exceptional as a mayor, and I'm hoping she's running again. But one thing I want to say is I've been elected since 2016, and sometimes our male counterparts will use our passion for what we're trying to do as women against us, as if that's not a positive. And I've had that happen to me, where my passion for something, to try to get something done, was used as oh, well, she's a woman, she's emotional, she's too passionate about that. So I do see it. I've seen it, and the subtleties and those long existing biases are very, very difficult to change. I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kathy. Over to you, Sarah. I feel like we're probably adding to your research portfolio.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and it's not surprising to me at all. I think the last few comments that we've been talking about are describing it, and I call it this like hall of power barrier because I don't know what else to call it, but it's this thing that's just repeatedly described to me when I speak to women in these roles. That's like, well, I get elected, and then I show up and I look around, and somehow I don't find myself within this inner circle of power that is held by very few in a lot of these institutions. And it's a difficult thing to track or to say exists or say doesn't exist. And women are inside of it too. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of women who also sit in those inner circles, but that's an additional barrier that a lot of elected women face. And I think that's what you're all describing, is this feeling that you get as soon as it happens to you and you know it's happening, and you're still being left outside of these institutions that you're actually inside of, which is really something quite fascinating, and a difficult thing to describe or to fix. But it just came up so often that I had to try and put a name on it. So that's what I call it. But yeah, thank you everyone for your questions and your comments. I agree. I think this is something that we could talk about all day. And it's also a presentation that could spawn into many different areas, and many different great ones were suggested. I think people are absolutely right. It could be broken down further by riding, by area of the province. There's so much data there to mine, but that's basically the work that I had done over the last little while, just kind of looking at the surface numbers and what we can glean from them and what they're showing us. And I think that gives us some indication of where we are. And I think it also puts a lot of pressure on the next few years, because it'll be very interesting to see where those trends go moving forward, and whether there actually has been as much change as I think we like to tell ourselves there's been in the last few years. But that'll really show when we take a look at the next few elections and what candidates we're running and who ends up in those spots at the end of the day. So that's all for me. But thanks everybody so much for your participation and for listening to me talk about charts for 30 minutes.
Well, I think you had a captive audience, Sarah. I think we're all a little bit sad that our webinar is coming too close. But just like one last thought for you, Sarah. So I know, like in investigating the statistics and obviously also collecting anecdotal stories and qualitative data as well. I'm wondering if you're interested in the intervention side of things, like how like social or community interventions, like having local grassroots leadership schools, are kind of pushing those numbers forward and changing minds and shifting community consciousness and community biases. But if you are, you definitely want to circle back to me. But
yes, absolutely. I'll be in touch.
And anyone else on our webinar, if you were interested in maybe partaking in something prior to the municipal elections for 2024, which also coincide with many First Nation elections, maybe we'll circle back and connect on how we can do something super cool before the next election cycle for municipal government. All right. Take care, everyone. Thanks so much for being on the call.